So 2018 was a pretty splendid year for me. I had some really cool experiences, made a lot of progress in a lot of areas, had some pretty big breakthroughs. But the goal-setting process that I used at the beginning of the year was an absolute disaster. It didn't work at all. Looking back on it, it was extremely stupid. It kind of blew up in my face and actually kind of burned me out for a while on even really setting goals. So I wanted to dive into that and explore the insanity of that process and the lessons that I learned from it, and share those lessons with you so hopefully you can learn from them as well and maybe not have to make so many of the same mistakes that I did. So here are 5 ways to fail spectacularly at your goals this year. So number 1 is to ignore the present. So one of the goals that I set at the beginning of the year was that I wanted to grow my YouTube channel to 10,000 subscribers. And I've obviously not done that, but it's not an unreasonable goal to set. You know, if I were to just keep making content and putting it out there, there's no reason to think I couldn't get there. But I also wanted to do this in the span of 3 months, while also working on 2 other large goals simultaneously, somehow. And while having this like huge barrage of like habits that I wanted to keep doing, and like these quotas for reading and like working out and meditating and on and on and on and on and on, just endless. So there's just this huge disconnect between like this intention for the stuff I wanted to do and then how I was actually mapping out my day-to-day life. That's what I mean by ignoring the present. And it's as if I was wanting to go to Detroit and Chicago and New York City, which are all reasonable things to want to do if I just drive to Detroit and then drive to Chicago and then drive to New York City. It might take a little bit of time, but not all that much in the grand scheme of things. But it's like I took this approach where the way that I did that was to set up a Garmin GPS in my car, set to go to Detroit, and then have Google Maps set to go to Chicago, and also Apple Maps set to go to New York. And those were all just shouting directions at me at once while I like drove around and did some errands or something. So it doesn't make any sense. But it begs the question, like I can so clearly see how insane this was looking back on it. The question is why? Why did I attempt something so preposterous? This brings us to number 2 of the 5 ways to fail spectacularly at your goals. And this is to ignore the past. So if I had looked back at like things I had actually achieved in my life and thought about those, I would have noticed that the approach I was taking to these goals was like completely in opposition to what had actually worked for me. Like an example was that at that time, like 2 years prior to that, I had never read a nonfiction book cover to cover. And in the time since then, in those 2 years, I had read something to the tune of like 50 to 60 of them. So that's a huge transformation. And I did not get there by like setting a huge, massive, ambitious goal simultaneously with a bunch of other ones and being like, I want to read 20 books in a month, yo! What I actually did was crack open one book and say, well, this feels pretty daunting to me, honestly, but I'm going to give it a shot. And then it became an adventure from there and became a huge transformation in my life. And so it's as if I was standing on this staircase, looking up at this door in the distance that I wanted to reach. And it seemed so far away, and so I was asking myself, well, how can I get up to that door? I need to find some way to fly. That'll do it. And if I had only turned around and looked back, I would have realized that I had already climbed just all these flights of stairs before, and all I really had to do was just keep climbing. But because I wasn't looking back, I wasn't making that connection. That brings us to number 3 of these 5 ways to fail spectacularly at your goals, which is ignoring the future. So kind of the flip side of not actually looking back at the journey that had brought me to where I was and understanding my own, ways of operating and what had worked for me already. The flip side of that is that looking forward, if we go back to the staircase analogy, looking at the steps up ahead, I wasn't able to see how I would go about that. Again, like I said, it's as if I was seeing those steps and asking myself, well, how can I like fly up to that door? if only there weren't these dang steps here getting in my way. And there's this fundamental human tendency where we see time that's ahead of us and we feel like there's so much to do. And so our approach is that we feel like we need to do it all at once. There's actually a book written about this very thing. It's called The ONE Thing. And just about this idea of actually focusing on one thing at a time and how... Oh, okay. I always thought it was an acronym, but it's just the word one. This book makes a lot more sense now. But the idea is this phenomenon... So it's this idea of domino effects, where you can focus on one small thing, and then that will knock over the next domino, which is larger, and then the next domino, which is even larger, and on it goes. And it's this geometric progression, which is not really how our minds tend to work. Like, we don't see a little seed and naturally assume, oh, if I take this, put it in some dirt, put water on it, it'll become some massive plant. It's not really how we tend to think. And so the idea is that really powerful goals are the ones that are just focusing on a particular thing at a time and just knocking that out. But the thing is, I had read this book actually multiple times. I was familiar with this idea of like the power of focus, and at least on some level I understood it and accepted it, and yet I was clearly so unwilling to put it into practice in my life. And so this begs the question, why is that? Why was I not willing to follow through on this idea that clearly made sense to me? What was missing? And so this is where I take this one level deeper, and it starts getting pretty interesting. Because what occurred to me is that if I'm unwilling to focus on one thing, if I'm instead living in a way where I have multiple goals that I'm telling myself, at least, that I'm working towards simultaneously, and I have all these like routines and habits that I'm constantly keeping up, and like reading quotas and yada yada yada, the way that my life becomes when I do that is that I always feel like I'm making progress. I'm always kind of doing something, and it feels like I'm accomplishing things. But if I focus on one particular goal and just put all my energy towards it and say, I'm gonna make this happen, this is like the one thing that I'm focusing on right now, what happens then is that I open myself up to the possibility of failure. I could put all of my energy towards one goal and not succeed. Whereas if my energy is scattered in a million different directions, even if I'm maybe not making all that much progress in a way, it feels like I'm making a lot of progress because I feel so active. And so deep down, unconsciously, I think, I had this fear of failure, and that was causing me to almost impulsively set up all these different goals for myself and try to do so many different things at once, allowing me to not actually face that possibility of sticking to one thing and maybe having it not pan out. And so that is the fourth way to fail spectacularly at your goals, is to fear failure. Now, many of us have had the experience where you need to be up early, let's say, and you're in bed, and you're getting ready to fall asleep, and it's like, okay, put your head on the pillow, gotta get up early, I'll be ready for this, okay, come on, sleep, I'm ready for you, buddy, come on, old sleep, old paleo, let's do this whole sleeping thing, and go out dreamland, and I'll be rested up like a snooze boy. And that goes on for a while, and then it's like 2 hours later, and you've been thinking about random junk for 2 hours and haven't slept a wink. And it's like the hyper intention for sleep actually pushes sleep away. In other words, the fear of not falling to sleep makes you not fall asleep. In other words, the fear of failure makes you fail. And that's the great irony of how this whole goal-setting process unfolded for me, because I was driven unconsciously by this fear of failure. And that caused me to set up these circumstances where I inevitably failed. There's no way I could succeed what I'd set out for myself to succeed in. And of course, the biggest irony in this was that it was in acting out of that fear of failure in such a preposterous way that I actually did fail completely, and then realized that there was nothing to fear. Because it was in failing at those preposterous goals that I ultimately made progress towards them. I saw what was not working, what was working, and kind of re-clarified everything and started actually getting things moving. But it begs the question, and this is going one final level deeper. If I was deep down afraid of failing, why was that the case? Why was I afraid to fail? Because the idea that failure is your friend, that in the end it's impossible to really fail because failing at something will teach you, that was another idea that I was familiar with, and I understood it on some level and accepted it. And yet my actions told a different story. So what was the misalignment there? What was missing? Well, what I realized is that when I was setting all these goals, the way that I was looking at failure was essentially that it would be a reflection on me, who I was as a person. That failure would mean that I was a failure, like I would be judged for it, and something kind of strange and nebulous. A lot of times these fears are pretty nonsensical when you actually look at them. But the bottom line is that I felt like failure would reflect on me. Me failing meant that I was a failure. But that becomes kind of interesting when you really look at it, because what that means is that the opposite would also be true. That if I succeeded, then that was a reflection on me as a person. And if I succeeded, I was successful. I was worthy as a human being. And so what that says about how I saw myself when I was setting those goals is that I had to achieve certain things to become worthy as a human being. In other words, that I wasn't at that time. And seeing that connection, for me, is what makes it all kind of unravel. Because it's that lack of self-acceptance that bleeds out into everything else and creates this cascade of absurd goals that don't work. Right? The lack of self-acceptance meant that I was afraid of failing because I thought it would reflect on me. And the fear of failing meant that I was afraid to focus on a single thing and do my best to make it come true and know that if I didn't succeed, I would learn, and that would be awesome. And the lack of self-acceptance also meant that I wasn't looking back into my past and understanding how I really operate and what would be the best way to move forward on my goals. And finally, the lack of self-acceptance meant that I felt like I had to do everything as soon as possible, make it all happen all at once, so I could become a worthy human being. And so for the fifth thing here, I want to reverse this all. I want to go through 5 ways to do the opposite. 5 ways to set goals that will be achievable and enjoy the process. First one being, don't ignore the present. Make the connection between the ideals, the goals, and the unfolding life. Don't feel like you have to cram everything in all at once. Number 2 being, don't ignore the past. Look back and see how you achieved things before, what works for you. Understand the real process there, and don't try to just feel like you have to do things in a certain way or change yourself. Number 3 being, don't ignore the future. Look ahead and realize that you do have time to achieve the things that you want to achieve if you just line them up in a way that's more sequential, where you can focus on one at a time, really knock down that domino, and then have the next one be bigger. Number 4 being, don't fear failure. Realize that failure is not a reflection on you. And in fact, you have everything to gain from trying and failing, because that's how you learn. And no one is really judging you for that in the way that you might think they are. And finally, number 5 being, embrace yourself. Accept yourself as you are. Don't tie up your identity in any of your achievements or goals. We are, all of us, luminous spiritual beings of infinite worth. To be alive is a priceless gift that we could never hope to earn through our actions. And so we can only assume that we're already worthy of it. We don't have to prove anything. And by having that mindset, the process of setting goals can become something joyous, exciting, and reasonable. It's something that can actually unfold in our lives. And that is the ground from which I am doing my best to work in the coming year, moving forward. So I wish you an absolutely amazing year, full of joy and success, and hopefully, most of all, self-acceptance. Thanks for watching. Look forward to seeing you again very soon. Happy New Year.